As we start our unit on the American Revolution, we are going to quickly be introduced to some of the most important events that led to the Revolutionary War and the founding of our country. Of course, there are more reasons besides the ones covered in this video that led to the revolution, but these are considered by most to be the most impactful. The first event that we're going to talk about is the Stamp Act. In 1765, to help earn back some of the money that they lost in a war with France, the British government imposed a new tax called the Stamp Act on the American colonists. At this point, a good majority of the products the colonists used were from Britain, and with this act, the British government now collected some money on transactions including newspapers, deeds, playing cards, dice, wills, and other important government documents. Many of the colonists disliked this new tax, and it was rarely collected. Often, tax collectors were met with riots. Eventually, the act was repealed, but that didn't stop the British from passing more tax-related acts in the future. Following the Stamp Act came the Townshend Acts. In another attempt to collect more money from the colonists, in 1767 the British government passed the Townshend Acts, a series of new laws that forced the American colonists to pay the British government a tax on all goods that they received from Britain. Instead of paying the tax, many colonists, especially those that lived in Boston, decided to boycott goods from Britain. Instead of buying British goods, many turned to buying goods from illegal trade. This led to the British sending troops into Boston in hopes to stop the resistance of the new taxes. The reason that so many colonists disliked these taxes and acts passed by the British government was that they had no say in the laws that were being passed. The colonists were paying a lot of money to the British government in the form of taxes, and the British government had power to pass laws that required the colonists to pay even more taxes whenever they felt necessary. The colonists, because they had no one in British government to represent them, were powerless to stop this. With new British soldiers in Boston, the tensions between the British and the colonists continued to rise. In 1770, after a disagreement between some Boston residents and some British soldiers, a crowd of about 200 Boston colonists surrounded the soldiers. Many of the Boston residents threw rocks and snowballs at the soldiers, causing them to lose their cool. The British soldiers opened fire on the colonists, killing 3 and wounding 2 others. This served as a major talking point for revolution amongst colonists, and in reaction to the massacre, the British government sent even more troops to Boston. 3 years after the Boston Massacre, the British government repealed the Townshend Acts and started to remove troops from Boston. One part of the Townshend Act stayed in place, however, a tax on tea. This act on tea restricted the colonists' ability to trade with other countries, forcing them to buy British tea at a much higher price. In an act of defiance to the act and to the British government, a group of radical revolutionaries boarded British ships in Boston Harbor and destroyed and dumped an estimated $1.7 million worth of British tea in today's money. In reaction to the Boston Tea Party, in 1774, the British government passed the Coercive Acts, which closed the Boston Harbor until the city could repay the money that the British lost. They also replaced Boston's elected city government with British officials. Another part of this act allowed British troops to be housed forcefully within colonist businesses and forced the colonists to pay for the construction of housing for the troops within the cities. The new acts and the presence of even more British troops continued to raise tensions between the colonists and the British. With revolutionary activity becoming more common, in 1775 the British Army marched south to Lexington from Boston in an attempt to capture revolutionaries, specifically Sam Adams and John Hancock. The British troops were met outside of Lexington by 77 American militiamen, and a battle ensued. During the battle, 7 Americans died, while 73 British soldiers were killed. This resistance was a great victory for the Revolution, and some consider this battle to be the unofficial start of the Revolutionary War. With all of the before-mentioned events and the Battle of Lexington, in 1776 in Philadelphia, a group of revolutionaries that would eventually become the members of the First Continental Congress drafted and signed the Declaration of Independence. This document was then sent to the King of England at the time, King George III, declaring the American colonies independent from Britain and starting the Revolutionary War.